Today I want to talk about U.S. trade policy. This is something that affects every one of us. It affects all the families I represent. It affects our economy in big ways. It affects our relations with other countries in significant ways. We're fortunate right now to have a strong economy. When you look at the numbers, it's very encouraging. The tax reforms that were put in place at the end of 2017 and the pro-growth regulatory relief that's been put in place is actually doing exactly what many of us thought it would do. When you look at the growth projections before the tax bill and the growth projections now, we've had a dramatic increase. If you look at the job projections, a dramatic increase in jobs, almost 2 million more jobs projected after the tax reform bill was passed. Why? Because the tax reform bill was pro-growth and pro-jobs. Helps middle-class families, but also helps small businesses like the ones I've visited all across my state of Ohio, all of whom have told me, you know, this is a nice shot in the arm for us. It gave us the ability to invest more in our equipment, in our people, in retirement savings. And tomorrow I'll see it again. We have a roundtable discussion at an Ohio manufacturer. This company makes tooling that's used in the aviation industry. And they've already told me that they like the tax bill. I'm going to ask them tomorrow what I ask all these companies. I've visited with over a dozen, well over a dozen, several dozen Ohio small businesses since the tax reform bill was passed. And I'll ask them tomorrow, specifically, what happened to your bottom line? And what are you doing with the extra tax savings you're getting? And what I'll hear, I think, is what I've heard at other places, which is we're investing more in people, we're investing more in equipment, and that's great. The latest jobs report reflects all this. When you look at the jobs report from last Friday, it was for the January time period. It showed an impressive 300,000 new jobs, way beyond expectations, 302,000 new jobs in January. It also showed, which I think is even more impressive, wages going up. So in Ohio, I will tell you, wages have been pretty flat. In fact, for the last decade and a half, on average, wages have not gone above inflation. So when people say, you know, they're feeling the squeeze, they are. Expenses are up, healthcare costs are up, other expenses are up, and yet wages have been flat. I think that's one reason people feel like, despite working hard and doing everything as they were asked to do, they were not able to get ahead. Now they can feel like they're getting ahead a little bit. If you look at the numbers on Friday, it indicated 3.2% growth in wages for supervisory jobs, and then non-supervisory jobs, you might think of as more blue-collar jobs, 3.4% increase in wages. That's just what you want. You want to see these wages starting to go up. This is above inflation. By the way, the wage growth over the past 12 months is the highest it has been since a decade ago before the Great Recession. So finally, we're sort of climbing out of this Great Recession, and we're seeing the kind of numbers we all hope for. This is all good news. And again, a lot of it is due to the fact that in this body and in the House, we passed legislation that helped to stimulate more economic growth, more jobs, and higher wages. What I'm concerned about is that we now not do something to jeopardize that economic growth. And this is where trade policy is a risk. Some would say it's already putting a damper on what would otherwise be even greater growth. But here's what I'm more concerned about than anything, and that is the possibility that as a country, we start to put more and more tariffs in place without showing that the imports coming in from other countries are being traded unfairly. Because that's what our trade laws basically say. They say, okay, if another country doesn't deal with us fairly, we get to level the playing field, right? So if they're sending their products to us and they're not fair, meaning that they're subsidized by the government, which happens a lot in non-market economies particularly, think of China, or they are sold at below their cost, which is called dumping, if they're dumping their product on us. That's not fair, is it? And we have trade laws to deal with that. And I believe in trade, but I also believe strongly in trade enforcement. And my legislation with Senator Brown called Level the Playing Field Act has helped us win these trade cases when these countries are dumping. As an example, there's a 269% tariff, that's a high tariff, on some products from China, rolled steel products. Why? Because we showed that they were, in fact, not following the rules by subsidizing and dumping. We should do that. There's also parts of our trade law that say, okay, for a temporary basis, on a temporary basis, temporary relief, we should be able to respond when another country sends a surge of imports into our country and you have material damage to a U.S. industry. So if it's a surge of imports and a U.S. company is materially damaged, we have a way to respond to that too. It's not permanent relief, but it says, well, wait a minute, let's let these companies get back on their feet and these workers keep their jobs while we deal with this surge of imports and figure this out. That's kind of how our trade policy works, consistent with the international rules. If there's some unfairness, then we're able to respond. Right now, we're doing this with China. The 301 law is being used to say to China, we're going to increase tariffs on your products because you are not trading fairly with us. You're using non-tariff barriers. You're not treating our intellectual property properly. You're forcing our businesses to be able to work in China, that many of them have to have joint ventures or special licenses. That's not fair. We want to level that playing field. So that's the purpose of those tariffs. And I think most people get that and understand it and support it. Even those who believe in more of a pure free trade mentality know that we shouldn't allow cheating. And we should help to level that playing field. The problem is that over the last couple years, we have started to use a part of our trade law that really is an exception to all of that. And that's called the national security exception, which is also called Section 232. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 has been in place now for 57 years. It's only been used a half dozen times in 57 years. Why? Because it's kind of a dangerous tool. You think about it, all we have to say as America is, this is a national security issue, and therefore we're going to put tariffs on your product. You don't have to prove any of the things I talked about earlier. You don't have to prove that there's been an industry that's been damaged. You certainly don't have to prove that the other country is sending product that's dumped, sold it below its cost, or that it's subsidized. You don't have to show a surge of imports. All you have to do is say, this is a national security issue for us, and put your tariffs in place. When you do that, guess what other countries do to you? They put their own tariffs in place because they're looking at this and thinking, oh my gosh, so the United States is just putting these tariffs in place without demonstrating that this is a trade enforcement measure because of unfairness or damage to their industries. So many of these countries, frankly, are happy to put more protectionist tariffs in place. Kind of works for them, too, because in many countries, that sort of approach, a more populist approach in, say, places like Europe or in the Middle East or Asia or Africa is, okay, we're going to put tariffs in place ourselves. And often that's applauded. But who gets hurt? Both countries. The consumers in both countries. Think of that. Everybody's got higher costs, higher taxes, higher tariffs on both sides, and eventually you end up building up tariffs to the point that it can be really dangerous for the economy. So that's my concern with Section 232, the national security exception, really, to our trade laws. Do I think it's a tool we ought to have in the toolbox? Absolutely. I think if there's a true national security concern, that we ought to have Section 232 there to ensure that we can respond. If we were in a time of war, as an example, and we needed to be able to produce tanks in this country, and we didn't have any steel production here, it would be appropriate for us to put some tariffs in place, in my view, and to help a domestic industry be able to provide that steel. And frankly, that's another avenue that other countries would do to us if they had a true national security concern. So there's a sort of level playing field there. It's permitted to do that under the World Trade Organization rules, and other countries would do it as well. But the way we have used it the last couple of years is a little different in my view. Now look, again, I think trade enforcement is really important. I'm a hawk on going after countries that are not treating us fairly. And I think with regard to China and overcapacity of steel, it's a huge issue. That's one reason we have these huge tariffs in place on Chinese steel. Then they transship it through other countries. We ought to be much tougher on that. We have legislation called the Enforce Act. Senator Wyden was here on the floor a moment ago. He and I have worked on that together. That's important. We need to do more, frankly, to enforce that, in my view, to keep China from going around to a third country, then sending it to the United States if it's steel that is dumped or subsidized. But to say that with regard to countries that are our allies, and with regard to countries we trade with every day, that we're going to use this national security exception, the 232, I got to tell you, I think that causes real problems. And you've seen it. Other countries have done what? They have increased their tariffs on us. Think of Canada. When you put tariffs on Canada saying it's a national security concern, even though, by the way, this is with regard to steel, a product that we sell more to Canada than they send to us. We send more steel to them from the United States than they do to us, and yet we're saying it's a national security concern with your steel from Canada, so we're going to slap on a tariff, say 25%. You know, what does Canada do? They turn around and they put tariffs on our products. We've gotten hit on that in Ohio because Canada is our #1 trading partner. We send more stuff to Canada than any other country, much more. And so our farmers in Ohio, our manufacturers in Ohio, are nervous because they're seeing tariffs go up on their products going to Canada, because Canada is retaliating because they don't see this as a fair thing that we're doing. They don't think it's a national security threat. So, again, Section 232 was designed, I think, properly to deal with real national security threats. I think it ought to be preserved for that. I think it ought to be used for that. And I think we ought to go after countries that are trading unfairly, aggressively. And when there's a surge and when there's a proven material damage to U.S. industry, we ought to respond. But I think we have to be careful as to how we do it. I think we're inviting otherwise this escalation of tariffs on both sides, which is exactly what's happening. I'm pleased to say that yesterday, a group of us introduced legislation to try to get back to the original purpose of Section 232. It's called the Trade Security Act. I introduced it last year. We reintroduced it again yesterday. I introduced it along with my colleagues Doug Jones, Joni Ernst, Dianne Feinstein, Lamar Alexander, Deb Fischer, Todd Young, Christian Sinema, and Roger Wicker. Not a group of members you would see on every piece of legislation. Some on the left, some on the right, some Republican, some Democrat, but a group that all agrees that in this case, it's best for us to have some constraints on 232 to take it back to its original purpose, which is really for national security. With regard to steel and aluminum and the 232 tariffs that were put in place back in 2017, you may know this, but when the administration was asked to opine on it, the Department of Defense said it's not a national security threat. That's now public. The memo from the Department of Defense said, we have enough steel production in this country to take care of our military needs. It's not a national security issue for us. The Department of Commerce had a different view. Their view was, this is broadly speaking a national security threat, so we should put these tariffs in place. Again, without having to show injury or damage or without having to show unfairness. Our legislation is a response to that. It doesn't affect what's happened in the past. It's prospective. But what it does say is that going forward, we ought to have to prove that it's a national security threat. By the way, one reason this legislation is timely is that the administration has said that they're now interested in putting additional 232 tariffs in place, potentially. And I say potentially because I hope they won't, not on steel and aluminum only, but also on automobiles and auto parts. So there's a lot of nervousness about that. I talked earlier about our strong economy and what, working with the administration, we've been able to do on regulatory relief and on tax cuts and tax reform. That's all good. But I will tell you, the trade policy issues on 232 are making a lot of people nervous. There's a lot of uncertainty about what might happen, particularly with regard to autos and auto parts now. In just a few weeks, the Commerce Department is required to release its report on 232. They'll make a recommendation to the President, whether to proceed with 232 or not. A lot of people, including a lot of folks in the U.S. auto industry and suppliers, are very concerned that the Commerce Department might find that auto imports threaten our nation's security, and they'll recommend the President take action. In my view, again, this would be a misuse of our trade tools. This is supposed to be for national security concerns. I don't think minivans from Canada pose a national security threat to the United States of America. I do know that it poses a threat to the workers I represent. It's going to be bad for the auto industry and bad for its workers. By the way, all three of the big three U.S. auto manufacturers are against extending 232 to automobiles. And that's why they're supportive of our legislation. I want to see more cars made in Ohio. I'm okay if they're made in other states too, but I want to see them made in America. I don't want to see more cars being made offshore. And that's what I'm concerned is going to happen if those tariffs go into place. Why? Because it's going to be a lot more expensive to make a car here. These cars are global cars now. The supply chains are all over the place. They end up being made in our states, including in Ohio, where we have a strong auto industry, and we love that, and strong suppliers. But they bring parts in from around the world. The analysis that I've seen shows that if we put 232 on automobiles, it would increase the cost of making a car in the United States by about $2,000. $2,000 a car. For imported vehicles, the cost would likely increase to about $6,000 a car. So think for a moment about the impact on the families we talked about earlier, who are finally seeing their wages begin to creep up. Working families who have played by the rules, done everything right. Finally, they're seeing this economy be strong enough. There's wage growth happening that's above inflation, and now they're told, guess what, you want a new car? $2,000 more for your new car. That means that car payment is going to be a lot more. That means, frankly, it's likely, I think, a lot of people will delay buying a car. That's not good for the auto industry. I think it's something that we should try to avoid. Second, compounding these costs is the fact that guess who's going to be in the crosshairs of retaliation if this happens? The auto industry. Guess what our number one export is from the United States of America in value? Number one export of any product. Cars and auto parts. So automobiles and auto parts are our number one export. And it's very likely if we put in these tariffs on a national security basis, not because of unfairness, not because of the surge, not because of domestic industry being materially damaged, which is part of the international rules that people understand, but if we do it because of our national security exception, it is very likely, and I think it is sure, that we're going to see retaliation, tariffs going up on their side, which again is going to hurt our country because 1 of every 5 cars and light trucks built in America is built for export, and we export a lot of auto parts, number one export. So I'm worried that it's going to put a target on the auto workers in Ohio and elsewhere if we move forward with this. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that the Section 232 auto tariffs would put 195,000 American jobs at risk. They also say that when retaliation is included, that jumps to potentially 624,000 American jobs on the chopping block. Now that's the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Check out their data on the website, see what you think, but it's a big risk. That's the point. These auto tariffs don't work. They don't work for farmers. They don't work for workers in other industries. They don't work, in my view, for our auto workers because of this big risk we're talking about. About 25% of our state's factory workers are export workers in Ohio. So exports are really important to us. We want more exports. We want people to knock down their barriers, so let us send more of our great made in Ohio, made in USA products to them. About 1 of every 3 acres planted in Ohio is planted for export. Soybeans, corn, wheat. We want more markets because we want higher prices. Our prices are low right now, partly because other countries have retaliated against us on agriculture. We want to open up more of those markets to create more jobs and higher prices for our farmers. Trade jobs, by the way, are good jobs too. These export jobs pay well. On average, 16% higher than other jobs. So it's not only more jobs, it's better jobs. So instead of inviting retaliation and closing off international markets, we want policies that are going to open up more markets. Cracking down on unfair trade, yes, absolutely. Cheating should never be acceptable. The level playing field is important, and there's not reciprocity now. We're a more open and free market than most other countries. So yes, but let's do it based on the rules, based on fairness, based on the kind of policies that aren't going to invite that retaliation. It's not only that national security is something we ought to use judiciously, When minivans from an ally like Canada are considered a national security threat, something's wrong. But it's also that this could be much, much broader than just autos. After the Finance Committee's hearing on Section 232 last summer, I asked the Commerce Department a question for the record about whether they believed that there was an industry, any industry in America, that could not meet the national security criteria in Section 232. Their response indicated that they believed potentially every industry in America could meet that criteria. So it could move from autos to other industries as far as they're concerned, even when, again, there's no sense that that industry is under pressure, is materially injured, or that there's unfairness in the trade. So I just think that's a huge departure from what this Congress meant 57 years ago when they wrote Section 232. It was meant to be for national security. And let's keep it to that. Let's use our other trade laws appropriately and aggressively for other instances. During the debate over Section 232, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, that's the committee in the House that deals with trade, a representative named Cooper from Tennessee, underscored the importance of the statute as a national security tool. He said, "The purpose of the national security exception is," and I quote, "to protect and preserve the national security. That is its sole purpose. It is not intended to serve as a device to afford protection to those industries who might claim it," end quote. But don't take the chairman's word for it. I refer you to the Cabinet Task Force report on oil import control. In 1970, President Richard Nixon directed the Secretary of Labor, George Shultz, a friend of mine who was later Secretary of State, to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the national security implications of oil imports, and it remains today the best historical resources we have on the proper meaning of Section 232. The report states, and I quote, "No determination under Section 232 or its predecessors have ever been made on the ground of economic impact alone. And in a generally healthy economy, it cannot be presumed that unrestricted trade in any one sector would by itself impair the national security," end quote. That was George Shultz. As I see it, with our economic growth and job creation right now, a trade deficit alone in automobile parts would appear insufficient to trigger restrictions based on national security. With this history in mind, it's worth noting that the 232 statute has been used, again, very infrequently since 1962. We can find only a half dozen cases when it's been used. There have been 26 investigations. Only 6 times did the President take action. The last one was, by the way, before this administration took action in 2017. The last one was 33 years ago, in 1986. And again, one reason that it's hardly ever been used is because it is viewed as an exception to our trade laws. You don't have to show injury to a domestic industry. You don't have to show a surge or unfair trade in any ways. You don't have to show that there is something under the international rules that gives you the ability to impose those tariffs that then don't result in retaliation from others. I remember after President George W. Bush was elected, there was concern about doing something to help our steel industry at the time, and we needed help in the steel industry. And Section 232 was looked at. They investigated it at the President's request. And in that case, the Commerce Department came back and said it's not a national security issue. So the President used another part of the trade law, an appropriate part where he had to, again, make some of these showings about material damage to the industry, which is Section 201 of the trade laws. So Section 232, again, has been narrowly defined until now. We need to get back, I think, to that proper definition. That's exactly why we need this legislation. Misusing Section 232 and the national security rationale not only leads to other countries increasing tariffs, but it also, in my view, risks us losing the tool altogether. And I think we ought to keep the tool. I think it's an important tool to have as part of our response if there is a true national security. But if you misuse it, I believe what's going to happen is that the World Trade Organization is going to find that we no longer have this ability. Why do I say that? Because there are already cases in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, against the United States. These cases are saying that 232 has been improperly used. They're saying, because they filed these cases against us, that they would like to have a decision by the WTO. I think we run a greater risk of losing this tool if the administration moves forwards with autos and auto parts. And I think that's a real problem. The WTO could end up saying the United States can no longer use this national security tool. I'd rather have us use it properly and be able to keep the tool. So yesterday, when we introduced this legislation, we addressed the misuse of this tool. We said we wanted to preserve it for national security threats. I want to thank in particular Chairman Chuck Grassley of the Finance Committee for his very positive comments that he has made about the Trade Security Act consistently, last year and again this year. Earlier this week, he talked about how he'd like to work with us to get this proposal done. So what does the proposal do? First, it ensures the proper experts in government determine at the outset whether it's a national security threat or not. I mentioned that right now that's housed in the Commerce Department. It should be at the Department of Defense. They're the expert to determine the national security basis for import restrictions. Under our legislation, if the Department of Defense does determine through their research that there is a national security threat, it then goes to the Commerce Department. The Commerce Department's in charge of the remedy, which is appropriate. And again, by the way, with regard to steel, we know that the Department of Defense said this is not a national security issue. At the end, of course, the President still makes the decision, but it's a two-step process to get there, which I think is very important. Second, the bill gives Congress a voice in this. It allows Congress the opportunity to disapprove of a Section 232 action by passing a joint resolution. Currently, Congress can disapprove of 232 actions through a joint resolution, but only with regard to oil, because when this was last used, back during the oil embargoes, Congress reacted by saying, well, with regard to oil, you have to have our approval after the fact. Now, I will tell you, our bill is not the only legislation on this topic. Other legislative approaches go further, and I think effectively take away the tool as a national security tool by saying, instead of a motion of disapproval after the fact, there has to be a motion of approval from Congress in order to move forward. I believe under the Constitution, the congressional Article 1 responsibilities, including commerce between the nations, require us to have a voice in this. But I also believe that the administration needs to have the ability to react and react quickly to a true national security threat and not to have to go through Congress, which sometimes, as you may have heard, takes a long time. And we tend to get tied up in knots up here quite a lot. So I like our approach better. I think it's about protecting auto states, export states, from the consequences of misusing 232 in the future, but it does it in the appropriate way. It's about stopping retaliation against our farmers and our workers. It's not retroactive, but it is prospective, saying, let's get the broadest consensus possible among industry, among members of Congress, within the Finance Committee, to get something done here that takes us back to the original intent of Section 232. When properly used, again, it can be an important part of our arsenal, of our trade enforcement arsenal, for a real national security concern. We want to keep it for that. But it should not be used inappropriately, as it has been, in my view, without showing the national security threat. My hope is that this legislation now can move quickly through the Finance Committee, through the Ways and Means Committee, that we can put in place something that makes sense to refocus on the original intent. Ultimately, I believe the economic and legal case for 232 tariffs on automobiles going forward cannot be made. I believe that's why we need reform. So let's restore this important tool to Congress's original intentions. Let's be sure Section 230 is used appropriately and selectively for genuine national security reasons. The strength of our economy, as I talked about earlier, comes from the right policies, but ultimately comes from hardworking and innovative Americans. In the shops and the plants, as I'll see tomorrow in Ohio, and the plant tour I mentioned earlier, the farms around our states that send products all around the globe. We want more of that. They deserve a level playing field. We should give them that, the chance to compete. But let's be sure our trade policy doesn't result in escalating tariffs that hurts those very workers, those very farmers and their families. Let's find the right balance, including restoring an important national security tool by not misusing it. I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting the Trade Security Act to help do just that. I yield back my time.